What I wanted to speak about today is changing landscapes in post-secondary education, and I'm going to make a few general comments and raise some questions about access and affordability and funding of post-secondary education. So this is sort of the policy area to my friend Sue. That's a nod to you. So access to and participation in post-secondary education has been a consistent policy driver across administrations in Ontario for the last 4 decades or more. It's been a driver in economic booms, and it's been a driver in economic busts. And if you look at the demographic studies, we can see that over the last decade, enrollments in colleges and universities have increased. In fact, if you look at the OECD's Education at a Glance 2015 study, Canada actually leads the world in highly educated adults. 53% of Canadian adults between 25 and 64 in Canada's population have completed post-secondary education, either college, university, or polytech. Now, this figure is 20% above the OECD average, and Ontario either mirrors or exceeds the national average. So we enjoy high participation rates, high levels of educational attainment, and these are significant achievements. So what are the policy challenges here? We need to ask who wins and who loses in this landscape. These numbers are only a partial picture of what's going on. They don't tell us anything about who's missing, who leaves early, how long students take to finish, and why. And moreover, when you look behind the aggregate figures and break it down by group, we see that participation, retention, and graduation rates of certain underrepresented groups, including Aboriginal groups, first-generation students, students with disabilities, women in certain doctoral programs, and students from lower income families are disproportionately have disproportionately lower representation in the access numbers. There are also regional disparities in post-secondary education across the country and across the province. So these gaps are all the more concerning when we lead the world in highly educated adults. Clearly, not everybody in our society is getting the same kind of access to post-secondary education. But there's another challenge in this story, and that has to do with affordability of post-secondary education for students and government funding of post-secondary institutions. Now, I want to do the current Liberal government's justice in terms of their efforts, but notwithstanding their efforts and their significant investment in post-secondary education over the last 2 decades, $6.2 billion has been invested, and notwithstanding their efforts to improve affordability by first freezing tuition and then implementing various tuition frameworks, and more recently by instituting, and I'll say free tuition, a free tuition plan for students in lower income brackets, which will help some of our students with more grants. And I say free because it's quite, there's a difference of opinion as to whether it's free. And notwithstanding the various increases over the last decade in government operating grants to colleges and universities, when we look at government funding and when we break it down per student, you can see that government funding today per student is less than it was 20 years ago. And this is in part because the government funding of the post-secondary system in Ontario has not kept pace with system expansion and increases in enrollment. The Ontario government itself publicly acknowledges in its differentiation framework, page 1, that post-secondary institutions' costs have outpaced their growth in revenues from operating grants and tuition. In fact, taken together, if you look at increased enrollments plus declining per student funding, this means post-secondary students are already educating far more individuals with less money. And according to the OECD, we're doing a pretty good job in terms of our participation rates. But a serious consequence of this policy direction is that underfunded institutions turn to private sources of funding, and then the conditions pressure them to revenue generate. It's also clear over the last few decades that successive provincial governments have shifted the cost of post-secondary education towards students with increases in tuition. They've pulled back on government funding of institutions, and they've allowed publicly funded institutions to make up the difference in tuition. As a result, tuition costs have steadily increased over the last 2 decades across all programs, and especially in the advanced and professional programs. Ontario has the highest tuition fees in any province in Canada, according to Statistics Canada, and there are some folks that try to say, well, that's not really true when you factor everything in, but again and again, Statistics Canada has the sticker price for Ontario as the highest. And the tuition-free framework, which caps tuition increases to 3% per year, is set to expire next year. at the same time that this new free tuition is supposed to, and the new financial aid system is supposed to be launched. As well as this, student debt levels at graduation have also increased. Now, the appropriate share of the cost of post-secondary education between government and the student has long been an issue for professional governments, for provincial governments in Canada. Underpinning these trends are philosophical questions over whether post-secondary education is a public good or a private benefit, and who should pay for it. Both of these trends, the decreased per-student funding and the increased tuition rates, are some of the classic markers of a system that's becoming privatized. So what? Why should we care? We should care because historically in Canada, education has been seen as a public good. An educated citizenship was seen as good for a free and democratic society. It was good for social transformation. It was good for nation building. Broad access to education was a public good.
1 minute.
And so governments chipped in on the cost. But this is changing. Government policy is increasingly viewing education, and particularly post-secondary education, as a private benefit, which should be paid for by individuals receiving this benefit. And this will inevitably narrow access, even with the new free tuition announcement. And I'd like to just jump ahead and say this, combined with the differentiation framework and the strategic mandate agreements, which is the government's roadmap for us, which is increasing the expectations for institutions with a laundry list of to-dos and metrics of things that are expected of us, but no more government resources. So how do we do all this? Where will the money come from to affect this vision? It's not coming from the government, and so that leaves two places: tuition increases or private sector money with revenue generation. And so this is the concern. This is the concern. So I'd like to just end with a quote from Clark Kerr, who described the university as a multiversity and characterized it as a city of infinite variety. I would say today that we're a city of infinite expectations, but certainly not infinite resources. And I wonder, what does a quality education look like in all of this, and for whom?